Hello, everyone, and welcome to Inside VirtX Live, where we examine the systems shaping media, culture, and public perception. I'm your host, Mary Jane, and here are the insights for today. Now, tonight, we're looking at one of the biggest shifts that's happening quietly in the global media space. This is a shift that a lot of people are not fully paying attention to, and I would say so because the Iran war is taking center stage right now. But this deal is something that will shape what the world watches and ultimately how the world thinks in the coming decades. There's a major power shuffle that's happening among the biggest names in the entertainment world, and this seems to be going unnoticed. Okay, let's start with the facts. Paramount Global is currently in advanced deal making, moving towards a merger structure with Skydance. Now, if you have been following the story last year, Skydance and the Paramount, went into this merger. But at the same time, Warner Bros. Discovery, one of the most powerful legacy media companies globally, is under pressure. It has been navigating heavy debt, restructuring, and the reality that traditional TV is fast declining due to a rapidly changing industry where online streaming is becoming king. Now, here's where things have escalated. There was a bidding war. Netflix initially made a move to buy Warner Bros., but not the whole company. They wanted the studios, the content, and the streaming assets. Basically, they wanted the future of entertainment. So they avoided the legacy burden of cable TV, old school networks, and, structures that constitute declining that will constitute declining parts of the business. But then there came a counter. Paramount, through its Skydance backed structure, stepped in with a significantly larger full acquisition bid valued at over $100 billion. And that bid won. Now, the bid won because it was backed by some interesting funders who are actually on our spotlight today. Netflix walked away taking a multi-billion-dollar breakup fee, and they chose to double down on their own model, which is global distribution, data, direct audience control. That's the Netflix model. But this deal has been approved by shareholders, but it's still under regulatory reviews across the United States and Europe. And if it goes through, it will combine major studios, streaming platforms, and even news networks under one structure, creating one of the largest media entities in the world. And this is where things get real. Why is it really under scrutiny and review by regulatory bodies? Is because it's a cross-border deal. A significant portion of the funding backing this merger is coming from sovereign wealth of the Gulf states. You heard that. Sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf, particularly from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. Some have 10%, some have more, but this is a significant portion of the backing of this merger deal. We're talking about almost 50% of this deal. Now, estimates suggest that tens of billions of dollars in capital are deployed into this deal structure. Now, to be clear, this does not automatically mean direct editorial control over content or newsrooms, but it does mean something very important. It means ownership, control, power, and influence. So who cares about the day-to-day running of the business? Because in media, control is not always about who's speaking. Control is about who decides what gets funded, what gets scaled, what reaches global audiences. And this is not a random, isolated move. Over the last decade, we have seen these same Gulf states making aggressive investments across sports, entertainment, and the global media infrastructure. I mean, from football clubs buying to major sporting leagues to production companies and now large-scale media consolidation. Guys, this is consistent strategy. And the strategy is quite clear. We're talking about, number one, economic diversification away from oil and tourism, because oil revenues are cyclical. And more than ever, we can see the fragility of this with the Iran war. You see what's happening at the Straits of Hormuz, right? But media, sports, and entertainment are global, scalable, and high margin, especially if you own IP and distribution. Number two, we're talking on long-term future forward global assets. By that, we're talking content libraries, rights, sports rights, platforms. These compound in value over decades and they monetize repeatedly. Ads through ads, subscriptions, and licensing. And lastly, we're talking about the good deal of building soft power. Soft power equals reputation and influence. Owning, or financing platforms. Now, this shapes how a country is perceived globally, what narratives travel, who gets visibility. We're talking soft power here that can position a country, more than ever. We see just the fragility of how these countries, especially in the Gulf states, have come under hit by Iran. And all the best if they position themselves, right? Guys, media is not just an industry. Media is infrastructure for influence. Media shapes perception. Media shapes aspiration. Media shapes culture. So when capital begins to concentrate at this level across platforms that distribute news, entertainment, sports, we're talking about, companies that own CBS, CNN, sports channel, animation channels, just name it. The question is not just who owns what. The question becomes who is shaping what the world sees, and over time, what the world believes. Now, guys, let's bring this closer home. Where does Africa sit in all of this? Because on one hand, African content is rising, but on the other hand, we see how ownership is still very limited. African creators are gaining visibility. There is global interest, but distribution is still largely external. Ownership is largely limited. And you see, monetization systems in Africa are still very much fragmented. And this means that Africa is participating, all right, in the global media system, but it's not yet controlling its position within it. And that is the gap. Because in a world where media companies are merging to survive, consolidating power, and global capital is flowing into content and distribution, staying as a service provider is not a long term strategy. The real shift that needs to happen is from creating content, we need to begin to own IP, intellectual property. From waiting for platforms, we need to begin to build direct audience relationships, just like the Netflix model. From thinking project by project, we need to build studios, slates, ecosystems, collaborations, huge partnerships, just like the one that we're seeing right now. Because the future of media will not be controlled by just by those who create the most, right? It will be controlled by those who own the most and who are able to distribute it effectively. And this is where the opportunity lies. Africa does not need to outspend the Gulf states. Hello, it can't even compete for now, at least for now, given the next couple of years. Africa does not need to outspend any state. It does not need to outcompete Hollywood at scale. But Africa does need to reposition, to think long term, to build assets and not just outputs, to collaborate, not remain fragmented. And most importantly, to understand that culture is not just expressed through media, it is shaped by those who control media. Because at the end of the day, guys, this deal is not just about Paramount, it's not about Warner Bros., it's not just about Netflix. It's about a global system reorganizing itself. And we are active, should I say, spectators or players, but at the backbench in it. And the real question is, where will Africa stand when that system unpacks itself, when that system finally settles? Now, that's the real conversation. And joining me to uncover and unpack this further is the co-founder of VirtX Limited, a tech mogul himself, Mr. Nana Kama. Let's welcome him as he comes right in.
Hello, hello.
Hello. Hello,
Wow,
hello, hello. No, no, exciting times in the media
exciting
world.
times indeed. Yes, and
Absolutely.
I love that intro. Like the just the setup of the whole conversation we're going to have. Very relevant conversation. Really powerful stuff that we're going to be talking about. I'm excited. So
Yeah.
I'm glad to be here. It's great to be here.
Yeah, yeah, great to have you here too, as always. Okay, so now we're looking at one of the biggest consolidations in history in the media space, biggest, largest media consolidations in history. What do you think that most people are missing here about what's really happening?
Well, the really interesting thing here, because I'm glad you even talked about it from an African perspective. How do we start to shape some of these things? But the really interesting thing here is that this guys, Skydance, are the newest company on the block of these three. They are barely maybe 20 years old as a company. Their CEO and founder is David
Hmm.
Ellis, who's in his 40s, early 40s. So you
Yeah.
have this really young company taking on age-old giants of the industry. Like they went against Netflix, and Netflix is also really new. Like it's the what people are missing is how late you start doesn't really matter here, because we're seeing Skydance take on Paramount, buy Paramount, and now moving in to buy Warner Bros, which is like huge for a 20-year-old company. And the bigger part is now Netflix is valued at about $400 billion, huge valuation. Um, Warner Bros is probably about $67 billion. And now the guys who are trying to buy them, Paramount and Skydance, they're valued at about $14 billion. So you have a $14 billion valuation company trying to buy a 67 thereabouts $billion company at a
Well,
$110 billion or $111 billion. So and Netflix is they're sitting at comfortably at $400 billion, and they walked away, decided to walk away from the deal, saying, we can buy this at the right price, but not at any price. So even they considered this like a ridiculously high amount to buy Warner Bros. For. So it is a very interesting dynamic here, because I think a lot of people miss that fact. A lot of people look at it as, oh, these guys are trying to buy and own this huge media conglomerate, which is the fact. But that bit underneath is just always, glossed over. So I find that really interesting, and that's one of the things I think people would, miss.
yeah, okay. I mean, that's a very interesting point that you're raising, to see just how young the companies are in comparison to like the big giant. These guys are legacy media companies, Paramount, Warner Bros, and they own most of like the well-known, names that we know in media. We're talking about from news to sports to movies to whatnot, and just the not that's the lack of financial capacity of Skydance. Skydance is also a very good name in media. I mean, Skydance would be
Mission
Tom Cruise's
Impossible.
Mission Impossible. Yeah, you can list some of them, right? They've done animation, they've done film, and they've done really good stuff, since
Even
their
in
their
games.
inception. Yes, in games. But I want to ask you something, because a lot of Africans will say, or a lot of people would say, oh, the problem is funding. We don't have funding, and you've just highlighted this. This is crazy that they would go like the Gulf states all the way. You wouldn't think that they might be interested in this sort of stuff, and all of a sudden they are bringing this crazy money. This is almost 50% of
Mm.
shareholding structure that is theirs. They combine forces to do this. The two questions here: number one, people who are saying funding, and we know that Skydance is owned by Ellison. um but we know who his dad is. Ellison is actually the son of Larry, the
Larry.
Oracle. Larry
Yes.
Ellison. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So would we say that, this has influenced, or his father, even though we don't have it in the media, he probably has gotten some counsel, advice, insights, whatever, to give him that sort of strength and fortitude to go against, to go, to acquire such a big giant? That would be number one. Number two, what would be the motive of the Gulf states that would make them combine such, forces to come together to, get this sort of powerhouse media in
Mm.
the US? What do you think? What are people missing out? What is going on here?
Right, and those are really two packed questions. So let's start from the first one, which is, why, how does such a guy have the, like I say, the confidence to make such a deal? Because if we unpack the deal first, now they've got funding from, they've got investment from the Gulf states, which is about 50%. But overall, that whole deal is going to take on massive debt. I think the estimate is at about $78 billion of debt that they're going to get financed through banks and other institutes. So it's not just equity investment, they're also taking on debt funding. This is billions of dollars that we're talking here. Like the company, you acquire a company and then you're straight in debt. So what does someone know to take on that kind of risk and to bet the rest of their, probably a few years of their life, 10-20 years, the next 10-20 years, trying to recoup that debt? What do you know to be able to do that? Because this company is valued, like you said, Warner Bros is valued at about 67 billion, and they're acquiring it for over almost twice the valuation. So what do they see? What do you know? And it's not hard to imagine that there might be some confidence that there's a fallback. There's always some wealth to sort of cushion any effects that could. But I think there's also a big mindset there where he's already had good success, I think, with Skydance, and he's had good success with Paramount, and that's still new, and that's not even consolidated properly yet. And then now there's this, so there'll be that thought that you're doing well. Why not just relax, take it easy, and enjoy the money that you're making, enjoy the wealth that you're making. And I think that might be even the common mindset, the regular mindset. But no, he's going like, we can do more. So what is driving that? What sort of thought pattern is really driving that? And that is the big question here. And I think it's something more about just ownership, knowing that ownership is the pathway to wealth. Is the pathway to wealth. And to the second point, why are the Gulf states actually, in getting this involved in this sort of deal? What is it about this deal that is so fascinating, and they're willing to put in, or even up to buy up to half of the equity in the deal? And you touched on it in your introduction. There's there's a big risk in keeping your wealth in one place, which we know it's been oil for a lot of these Gulf states. They've been diversifying. First,
and tourism, though they're doing well with tourism.
Yes, so they position first as a place to actually visit, to tour, and as a global hub for business. They've positioned really well as a global hub for business. Absolutely. And that, I think, is one of the key factors here, where if you position yourself in that sort of way, tourism and business, people come in, have business deals, discuss business on your turf, then you are privy to some of these business deals. So it's not far-fetched to imagine that creating that sort of environment for business has made this sort of deal possible, where those kind of business deals can actually be discussed in these states, right? So, and anyone who's sort of pitching this idea to say, hey, come invest in this deal, we're going to do this and this and this and this, they probably pitched to them as well. And they thought, what, we've been diversifying our income, we're diversifying revenue, this is a good deal, let's take it. But the other thing I really want to point out is like this level of funding, no one is thinking, I'm going to make this back in the next 5 years. No one is thinking back like right away. They're thinking this is the long game, 20 years, 10 years, 20 years, and that is something that I think is at the core of this, that to be able to look at an environment or at an asset or at a deal and
Mm.
say, in the next 10 years, this is going to be double the value. We're going to make this money back, and we're going to, be the most influential, or, whatever it is that to be able to think that far ahead is, I think that's one of the key factors that will be influencing this kind of deal.
Wow. That is really packed. I love it. I love that you say, okay, they opened up their countries to tourism, and of course, people flooding, and also for a lot of people to do businesses. I know a lot of people, even billionaires from the US, from the UK, people go stay in the UAE, in Qatar, to go conduct business from there. Very enabling environments to work, and of course, they begin to have these sorts of conversations. And once you begin to have these sorts of conversations, this is exposure, and whatever it is can happen from there. Fantastic. And then it's the long game. So where do you think that Africa, let's talk about Africa. How do you think that Africans should be thinking right now? I mean, with regards to what you just said, we're talking about playing the long game. This seems to be like a thing that is lacking in Africa. We don't know how to plan for 2050, even 100 years down the line. Do you see where is almost like we're caught up in this consumption and immediate gratification mentality, where we have to see, you go to investors within Africa and they say, how do I get my money back? That's all. How do I get my money back? And it seemed to be like a normal thing right now. People want, where's ROI? How should we position? Yes, people want to, get their monies back. People want to see benefits, rewards from their labors. But for investors, for as a country, as as media, people, media enthusiasts, and owners of studios in Africa, how do you think that we need to position right now, to play the long game, to move into ownership, as you said, is a pathway for wealth?
Yeah, I mean, that is the answer to that can be complicated, and broken down in so many different ways. But we were in a session last weekend, I believe, where this sort of question was asked, like, what can an average African leader do to position for the long term? And one of the panelists on that session answered about it being thinking about your successor. The first thing once you start a business, the next thing you need to do is to think about how a succession plan really. And that, as wild as that sounds, like you're still trying to get revenue, you're trying to, set up your business, you're already thinking of a successor. There is something there that is really relevant. And now you might not have the bandwidth to think of that when you're setting up. But thinking of a succession plan, like, how can this business run without me, so you can actually focus on other things or retire or whatever, is very vital. And that is one key to long-term thinking. But the other thing would be, there's just a lack of knowledge about how a lot of all these things work. There are no real insights into what it takes to be long-term thinking. What is the value? Why should I even think long term when tomorrow there could be another scarcity? So within Africa, there seems to be a really deeply entrenched scarcity mindset. We see that with the protests.
Is it valid though? I mean, we're looking at hunger. We're looking at the average, man in different countries in Africa saying they're living under less than $1. Is this a media narrative? First off, is this a media narrative, or is this true? Are people in Africa? Someone said to me they went to some country, and I would not mention, some countries, and people are just looking well fed, and they were expecting to see very hungry people, and they're wondering what is portrayed on the media. So because media is a very, very, media shapes culture and narratives in a way that we even begin to look at ourselves in the way that people are saying we are, as opposed to looking at the reality of our situation. So first off, and I'm not saying that there are people who are not hungry or there are people who are not poor. I mean, you don't live in Nigeria, being out of the country to developed nations of the world, where I see people on the streets sleeping outside and I have to offer them something. Do you see? So this poverty and this homelessness and this scarcity that we're talking about, is it media perpetrated? I know this is just a little bit out, but I mean, it'll build a solid foundation for, I think, what your point might be.
Yeah.
Or are people really hungry, and is this scarcity mentality really a thing that is valid in our conversations?
Well, I mean, the mentality, I think the mentality creates the situation. I don't think it's the other way around, because there is a lot of money that flows into
Ooh.
African continent as a whole. A lot of money flows through Africa. Nigeria, for instance, is one of the biggest producers of crude oil, and a lot of money is flowing into the state. But the mindset of that scarcity keeps that money closed off, and money should flow around. Money is its currency. It should transact. It should go around. It should actually pass and exchange hands, and that's how it grows in value. But because of that mindset, the money stays locked down. So I don't think it's valid to see it as the environment creates the mindset. I think the mindset has created the environment. Now, what creates the mindset is actually, I still think, is lack of proper education or knowledge around how money works, or how governments can be structured, or how companies can grow. So there's a lot of that's missing. And when there is no knowledge, there's going to be a lot of heartache and problems in society that would plague the society. So a lot of people would go to study for a specific thing. They can study maths and study it well for years, but still have no understanding about social norms, or no understanding about culture, or about media, right? So there's education, but there's still some massive gaps in knowledge in the society. So I don't think it's valid to. Yes, there are situations where a huge population of the continent, or of the countries, are actually really poor and are living in poverty. But it's not. That's the reason. The reason is that's not the reason for that mindset. That's what I'll argue.
Wow. I love it. I love it. So the narratives is what now shapes, the behavior. And that's it. Narratives shaping culture. Okay,
Yeah.
fantastic.
Don't tell your story. Someone else will tell it for you. If you don't tell your story,
absolutely.
You end up believing what they say.
Yeah, and the part you bring about knowledge, there's a popular line about knowledge making a man unfit for slavery. And just the more the more exposed your mind is, then the better your freedom and the quality of your life, you see. Okay, so let's take the conversation even further, right? Let's talk about the fragmentation in Africa. Let's talk about collaborations, and of course, the developing issue that hits closer to home. I mean, recent reports of xenophobic tensions and attacks against Nigerians and other African nationals in fact, South Africa. It's a very interesting twist of fate. So there's xenophobic tensions and attacks against Nigerians, Ghanaians. They put it as Nigerians, Ghanaians, and other African nationals. This is not new, but we see it raising concerns again. Very interestingly, in an interesting twist of fate, we see Ghanaians trying to kick Nigerians out of their country. We see South Africans kicking Nigerians and Ghanaians and other blacks, including their neighboring Botswana and Namibia and all those people, out of their country. We're talking about this sort of fragmentation, whilst we see other people collaborating in such a way. And I listened to their president, who stylishly condemned the attacks, but the majority of his speech was on the fact that we don't want illegal immigrants who would come and cause disruptions, and they should obey. And I'm like, what sort of speech would this be by the president of a country? So we see this sort of fragmentation from the leaders to the people, within Africa. What
Mm.
is the hope for Africa in terms of collaborations in a way that will endue us with the sort of power that we need to give us a voice, in the world that we live in? Is this
Mm.
even a possibility? Is it ever going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, all things are possible, right?
All things are possible. Yeah, we don't even see this
And
collaboration within countries. I mean,
mm,
independent studios within countries. How much more, without?
mm,
So,
yeah, I think a key factor here would be that mindset of staying too attached to your your own outcomes. Or the way I'll put it is this: so recently, the King Charles visited the US, or he's been in the US, and
he's gone now.
yeah, but if you think about it, like the US and Britain and the United Kingdom were enemies hundreds of years ago. There was a civil war, there was a breakout, like the US broke away from British imperialism, and they should be sworn enemies. They should
Mm,
be. But within years, they're like one of the biggest allies, and King Charles is there defending their partnership as countries, as allies. And this is what you don't see, like typically within African nations. A nation
mm.
goes to war, and they are at war perpetually. They are at each other's throat. Like nothing is forgivable. You can't forgive anything. So there is no. There is, how do I put it? There is no. People hold on to hurt and pain a lot more. So there's a mindset of once an enemy, always an enemy. There is they don't really see how you can leverage something, turn a situation from bad to good. Like once a situation is bad, it's bad. You just throw it away. That mindset is at the heart of a lot of these things, because how can you have the same xenophobia come up every time, over and over and over again, every time, and it's sinking deeper into the
What do you
culture?
think is causing it? I know
I
you're
think
going to
it's
answer the collaboration question, but what do you think is causing it at the root
I
of
think it's
it?
the same scarcity mindset. I think it's the same, and there's a very primitive part of the human brain that looks out for things that are different to us. And
Hmm.
those things that are different to us are what we are afraid of. And
Hmm.
it's easy to tap into that primitive part of our human brain, of our human emotion, and make the thing that is different from us the enemy. So it's a very primitive part of our human brain. Everyone is very susceptible to this. Right. So once you can tap into that emotion, into that fear, and say these people are different, it's not far-fetched to link them to the cause of your problems, right? So I'll go back to education and knowledge and understanding, things, subjects, concepts, social norms. Without that sort of understanding and knowledge, it is easy to fall prey to that primitive human brain of yours that says the people who are different from you are the problem. Right? So you have to be able to elevate your knowledge and your awareness of your society, of where you are, of yourself, to see beyond that and say, how can these people be my problem? How can I make this seemingly bad situation into something that is positive? Right. So that is what I would say. I think that's what causes it. It still comes down to the thing of lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, lack of awareness.
Like what you're saying is actually very phenomenal. So I hear you say is that there's a lack of education. Now, education doesn't just mean passing through the four walls of schools. We're saying that there is just this educated people that somehow, forgive my harsh words, that they're still illiterate in their thinking, in their understanding of how, systems work, how politics, their understanding of politics and economies and systems, because, this is really about looking outward I mean, countries look outward to develop their countries inward. And there I was listening to this political leader yesterday saying that no one can come from outside to develop your country for you. And I was listening to this speech that people were cheering and saying, foreigners, nobody can really, this is not even from South Africa, this is another African leader saying nobody can come that you need to get up and work and build your, and I'm like, how ridiculous is this? Like, we've had entire countries that were built on the back, even America built on the back of foreigners for decades. Egypt years ago. This is how, but I'm not going to the dark side of slavery and how they're forced laborers, but I'm just saying that people bring in their difference to come advance, usually to come advance, whatever nature it is. I speak about the Jews, and we all know about anti-Semitism, right? And we see how the Jews own like the biggest platforms and one of some of the wealthiest people in the world, in America, in the UK, and just around the world. And they go there, and really, whatever it is they own belongs to the state. They pay taxes to the state.
Yep.
A Jew builds a crazy business in America.
The state gets the
American
benefit.
The state gets the benefit.
Yep.
So what is this fear? And I think you hit it on the head when you just say is a lack of knowledge. This is just a huge level. I listened to some of them talking, spewing so much hate and saying that they're taking the jobs. And I'm like, nobody takes jobs from it. Well, isn't this a narrative? Now, this brings me to the question about narratives. Narratives, even within Africa. Right. Do you think that some of this, I mean, I was in Ghana not too long ago, and I sat with some Ghanaians, and they were telling me a lot of stuff about Nigerians that I could tell in my head where was a figment of someone's imagination that the person began to voice, and it just became a PR stint. It just became a thing. And the whole of Ghana runs with this narrative now. And it was about that Ghanaian girls were all good and Nigerians came to corrupt them because Nigerians brought prostitution to Ghana. And I'm like, wow, Ghanaians are so rich that Nigerian girls go to Ghana to do prostitution. And this is such a real narrative that if you're Nigerian, she told me she went to school in Ghana from Nigeria, and that's all they were calling her, that the boys were thinking that she was cheap, and she faced a lot of discrimination in school with names, in Ghanaian names for prostitutes. They were just, they get all sorts. And it's a thing. And that the Nigerians are the ones bringing all the bad culture, and the Ghanaians are, and they paint this picture of saints in Ghana and horrible people in Nigeria that bring in horrible culture and begin to influence people horribly. And I'm thinking, how do you believe such a thing, that there was no prostitution, and prostitution was not a big deal prostitution has been from Bible days. There was a prostitute, Rahab. There are prostitutes everywhere. In Amsterdam, there's the red light district. There are prostitutes in America. There are prostitutes in the UK. There are prostitutes everywhere. Prostitution is a big deal everywhere. And you think that Ghana was immune from that prostitution, and it was Nigeria that came to teach these people. Oh my goodness. Do you think that the narratives that we're telling, using even our stories in film, do you think that is a huge contributor to this sort of, behavior, this sort of hostility that we see amongst Africans?
It's a very, very interesting topic to think about, because there are both sides to this story. And, sometimes once a seed is sown, it just starts to grow. All it takes is for someone to perpetrate a narrative, and then if it takes root, it starts to grow. And then at some point, there's this saying where is it the life imitates art, and then no, art imitates life, and then life imitates art, and then life starts to draw its very meaning for existence from art. And so that's the same thing with a narrative. A narrative takes root, and then at some point it begins to grow, and then because of that narrative, it becomes an identity. So the average Nigerian, maybe just going into Ghana, would end up just being told you're a prostitute, you're this and that and that. And because they hear that so many times, it starts to reinforce itself and becomes sort of like an identity. So Nigerians in Ghana then have that sort of identity. So there's those two ways to think about things, where the narrative starts, it takes roots, it's a seed, and it grows into something bigger. There's the other aspect of it that we always want to attribute, like I said, some blame to external forces. Now, if you look at all the xenophobia and all those sort of hate between nations and between the citizens of nations, they tend to look at different aspects of society. Like in education, our children aren't getting good education because they're foreigners in there. In jobs, people aren't getting good jobs because
what is it about? They're not getting good education. I did hear that,
exactly,
and I'm like, okay, the classrooms are full. What is this?
Yeah, it cuts across everywhere. Like, these guys are coming, taking the best education, okay, and they're taking the best jobs. They're becoming the best prostitutes. They're becoming, the best criminals. So it cuts across every part of, the society. They're not, but except maybe the government. But every part of society is affected. So how can it be that this same set of people are the best criminals and the best students and the best workers? It is. If you think about it from that perspective, it is really quite absurd. So we paint this narrative sometimes to make ourselves feel better and make others feel worse, and also to try to push out or remove blame from yourself, because prostitutes are being paid for by people. People are the citizens. Who are the people? Like, the majority of the society will fund whatever ills the society faces. So if you're there are people, citizens of your country, consuming that. That's what's in demand. But it also removes responsibility from enforcement, from law enforcement. I find it ridiculous that nobody says we need better policing system. Nobody says we need better, enforcement of power. They just say there's more prostitution. The solution is to make sure that anyone caught in prostitution or caught in crime is really punished. No one says that. No one talks about law enforcement.
And just to add, the South African police are known to be one of the most horrible and most corrupt police, that we find in the world, in Africa. I mean, we complain about our police in Nigeria, but they are nothing compared to the horror stories that I hear about the police. I'm saying on a first-hand basis of people that I know that have lived in South Africa. And of course, we don't even have it far-fetched. I mean, Trevor's book talks about it. Trevor talks about it. Trevor, no, I mean, and I was just thinking when you said, nobody says we need better police. I can imagine that if some Nigerians went there and became citizens and enrolled and got into police force, then the narrative would be, it's the Nigerian people that have come to spoil and to corrupt our policemen. I'm sorry, I just want to add that.
Yeah, and to be fair, sometimes, when because it'll seem like you're taking away all the blame from, Nigeria or Ghana and, from the foreigners in that sense. You'd always have bad elements in every society. From every nation, you'd have bad elements and good elements. Now, when sometimes it's the bad elements that get exaggerated, they are the ones that, make the news. It's the bad news that actually gets more popular. You could have, 100 Nigerians in a society and 10 of them are criminals. And those are the ones that all Nigerians are criminals. So, but there will be those elements in society that do that, and they give the rest a bad name. So we also have to look at it from the perspective of how well do you represent your country wherever you are, or how well
Mm-hmm.
represent, your nation, your whatever it is, wherever you are, because it is quite important that someone would meet you and go, "Oh, okay, I thought all Africans were this, or all South Africans were xenophobic, or all this, but you are actually pretty, friendly. You are really warm. You're hardworking. Whatever it is." So we have to also think of it from that perspective, to say it's not all lies. It's not lies that there are criminals, and there are maybe some of the most notorious criminals who might be foreigners in these countries. It is not far-fetched, and it's very plausible, right? So let those people be punished. Let them be punished. Let them be caught. Let them face
Absolutely.
the law.
Absolutely.
Should. But to make it a blanket statement that it is a certain group of nationals that are a problem in a country is actually, honestly, really disappointing. It is very disappointing. And we started talking about collaboration, and then we've come to this because it's quite a hot topic, so it's hard not to really dig deeper into it. But how can you collaborate when you have some of these really, I'll say, it's a really primitive problem. It is a primitive problem. It taps into very real human fears that is, if to an untrained mind, it's easy to fall prey to.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I thought you wanted to talk about collaboration.
Yes. So yes, collaboration is, even, I think the best thing to do to start from, even if you started from a corporation sort of standpoint, because if we try to look at it from a national perspective, it's really messy. Let's not try to answer that right now, but let's look at it from a corporation perspective, and how collaboration can actually be fostered. Now, we see that from this Paramount deal and Warner Bros. And the Gulf States Fund, that a lot of parties have come together to actually make this thing possible. A good number of parties with a lot of money and a lot of risk. It is huge risk. And what you find is that there is very little appetite for risk within some of the African companies and African, deals that you make. You talked about investors within African investors are some of the most risk-averse investors in the world I have ever met. Like, they want their money back in 3 months, like next week. It is absurd how risk-averse African investors are. And then also you have African companies are also hugely risk-averse. So a company would easily take a cash deal rather than an equity deal. So if, for instance, you wanted an animation company to make something for you, they would want to get the money up front, straight up, in the pocket, and that's it. Meanwhile, the intellectual property belongs to you, you've commissioned this project. You keep that intellectual property, and you start to make money from it. Now, let's talk about the African animation industry as a small piece of this. It's valued to be roughly, the African animation industry is valued to be roughly about $15 billion as of 2025, I think, as of last year. I think it's roughly about that. So that's a good amount of money. It may not be like, hundreds of billions like, the worldwide or Western animation industry, but $15 billion is something. And you think, okay, why are we complaining about funding if the animation market is valued at 15 billion? Well, the money that actually stays within the country is probably less, within the continent is probably less than $1 billion, because it's the intellectual property never belongs to the continent. It leaves the continent. So you create this.
So where's the remaining, the remaining money, the remaining 14 billion? You said
The remaining 14 billion, it goes
to?
into software licenses. It goes into intellectual property ownership. So that is money generated by content that the African continent produces, but it never goes back to the African continent. It belongs to the people who actually own these things, right? So this is one of the reasons why, there is you can keep saying there is no funding, but that risk aversion to say, you know what, don't pay me, let me get 10% of this intellectual property, of the royalties. That is unheard of. I don't know anyone who's made that kind of deal within Africa, but that is one way to actually start to, own some of these intellectual property. I know we're talking about collaboration, but I'm starting from that risk aversion to say, how do you increase your appetite for risk? You
Right.
have to really look at the upsides and say, in the next 5 years, 10 years, this would be worth something. And even if it's not, we would have done something, would have learned something, massive. But of course, you do your risk analysis and all that. Collaboration really means that you have to share some of your winnings with someone else. There is
And
a
that
big,
people are unwilling to do.
people are unwilling to share. Everyone wants to be, the one who takes all the wins. It means that you have to say, I would rather have a small piece of a big pie than, have the whole pie and maybe the pie is only like a little thing. So there's no willingness to structure things in that way. And I think it's also down to a lack of trust. So we have risk appetite really low. We have a really low trust society, and we have an unwillingness to share. So I think those would be the three main factors that you'd have to overcome to actually step into a place where you can collaborate a lot more.
And I think that this also, I mean, I'm sure you're down to your points. I think that this also answers the question on legacy wealth and succession planning. Because I mean, if you have these trust issues, you don't know how to share, and all these issues you've mentioned, then it's just really difficult to grow a company that will outlive you.
Yeah.
Right, because
Yeah.
because the biggest names are having co-founders, and I think that a lot of people just want to have their names behind whatever is just
Yeah.
their names. Just
And,
this
and
unwillingness.
and
Yeah,
you've
go
talked
ahead.
about it a few times where someone starts a company and then, after they pass on, the company just deteriorates and goes down, and it becomes a mess. The children or whoever takes over, they don't know how to run the company.
Oh
And
yeah.
the inability to think beyond that, to think that after I'm gone, how would this thing continue to last is one of the biggest things. So when we always think about funding as the biggest problem, it just means that we think that once you have enough funds, then
Mm.
business will continue. But
Hmm.
funds do actually deplete, and
Money
here
has wings and flies away.
it flies away. And here we see this. We see David Ellison and the Gulf states and Paramount really taking on a lot of debt to build something, to buy a company, to buy this big conglomerate. That, of course,
Yeah.
there's a lot of challenges against it. So we see how people use money differently. Like, he could think, I have the money. He has enough money to retire, and live comfortably. He could think of it
Yeah.
that way. The company will continue, but no, he takes on more risk and tries to build something bigger than what he already has built. So yes, what those would be the three things, and the sort of my perception of my take on
As
collaboration.
in, and your perception is so fantastic. Your takes are just wonderful. You know, I think, just to summarize, or just to add, the media angle is how Africans are being portrayed to other Africans. We've talked about it. Media, both traditional and social media, plays a huge role in shaping stereotypes, in shaping narratives, in shaping biases. And you talked about the difference, us just not letting go. And I don't know where, well, that would also come from lack of knowledge, which you actually highlighted. We don't know how to let go because we do not see the benefit of it. I think that if people saw the benefits of letting go, and this is what politics is about, this is what government is about, this is what economics is about, is, they will say that there are no permanent enemies. It's just, just interests,
Mm,
which to a very good which to a very good extent is true, because this is why there is lack of policy continuation in the countries in Africa, where you see that one government goes and the next person just completely wants to obliterate whatever policies and whatever legacies that the previous government has put in place, because they're opposing powers. So there is lack of continuity even for good policies, and this is because there's hate, there's bile, and it cannot let a country grow. And I know that this is we've been hearing this sort of motivational speeches since we were young, but obviously implementation is a problem. That's why we're still here. When narratives are repeated consistently, a group becomes associated with certain behaviors and people's perceptions become reality. And over time, that perception can influence action, like we're seeing in South Africa and in Ghana. So beyond policy and economics, what we've said today is that we have to ask ourselves, what stories are we actually telling about ourselves? And who's controlling those narratives? What story should we be telling us about ourselves? And what sort of narrative should we be perpetuating? I think there's also a lack of knowledge about how powerful the media tool is. I think that would be like the last question you ask. Do we in Africa, do you think that we understand the power of media, in shaping culture, in forming perceptions, in changing, because we grew up on the entertainment part of media, just media being a tool of entertainment or news, right? But do we understand that there are agendas and there's a purpose to this entertainment, and there is so much power and influence in how it actually shapes the way an entire group of people see themselves, how they behave, how they dress, how they talk, and just their mindsets in general?
Yeah, that understanding is, I think it's lacking, because a lot of times when we think about media shaping culture, we think about it from the perspective of culture as in attires. We think about it from the perspective of culture in language, in the big things. We think about the really big things. We don't think about it in terms of ideology. So for instance, of course, we talk about maybe Western portrayal of Africa and, as a primitive place. And then we try to portray like, no, it's there's cities here. So in our films, we try to showcase the lavish lifestyle. But one of the things I was really considering earlier this week was how nuanced some of these ideologies can shape, can reverberate across the world. And one thing that I like to talk of, like, we've recently been seeing a lot of things about toxic masculinity. And, there was this big documentary about male toxic masculinity and, undermining females and things like that. And then my mind went back to, there's the thing called the bro code, that actually has been in existence, through high school, at least my time, or university. There was a bro code kind of thing. And bro code was actually widely popularized by Barney Stinson in How I Met Your Mother. It's a comedy series that went global. It is, How I Met Your Mother, Barney Stinson, played by Neil Patrick Harris.
Stop it.
Yeah, it is. It is from that bro code came about. And even before then, there was another series called Seinfeld that, talked about man code or something. But Barney Stinson popularized this through How I Met Your Mother, which was a global phenomenon. It was a big hit show, right? And so we had this whole bro code movement where, and if you really think about it, and Barney Stinson was one of the coolest characters, arguably the coolest character on the show. So, he's like really always in sharp suits, really funny, charismatic actor, played the guy. So bro code became a thing, even in Africa, like all the way from the US, from a US show. Even within Africa, there's people talking about bro code, and they have embodied that ideology, like even up onto growing stages. And now every ideology in the next generation manifests itself in a bigger way. And now we're talking about toxic masculinity, which is like an upgrade from bro code. bro code would be like your friends, your male friends, above any other female relationships. So
My God,
imagine men abandoning
I
their
can't
wives.
believe this. Yes,
Imagine men abandoning their
yes, I
wives
know
to,
this.
yeah, to just hang out with their buddies, like, and that becomes a thing. Like, and then this thing has seeped its way all the way across the world from one sitcom. It is one, like,
Wow.
no doubt it is one sitcom. So we look at all the bigger things like, oh, we have to show that we wear masquerades and we dance and we wear costumes, and that's, we must not lose our culture. But that culture of equal respect for, our women, or, a man being responsible for a family or being responsible for his children, choosing to take care of his family over his friend, has actually been eroded to a big extent. And if we're not careful, we actually have, a lot of these influences seeping in, and we don't really know about it. So that's one thing I really wanted to point out. Like I thought about, is like, we think about culture as this really big thing, but there are many things about ideologies that shape how society develops. And now we have toxic masculinity as a big problem, but it started from somewhere. I don't blame Barney Stinson entirely, but we can see some of how these things are linked. That was a long answer to the question, but
No, that was a very fantastic answer, because I do know about bro code. I do know about this from back when, way back when. Not like I'm old, but I know this. I know some people who did, in the name of bro code, didn't marry the girls that they wanted to marry. They said someone had dated her and it was bro code. If someone had dated her, even if they had broken up, nobody could date that girl again. It was a thing, and I just didn't know that it
in
came from one
Nigeria,
sitcom in Nigeria. What are you talking about? Such a thing. I heard it from here. I didn't hear it from no sitcom.
and yeah, that's
So,
see, that's the funny thing, because a lot of people won't have even heard it from the
from the
sitcom
source.
itself, but
Yes.
it just became so pervasive across culture among men.
No,
It was
so we're
so
talking
powerful.
about intentionality in creating content, right? That we have to be intentional about the sort of content that we're creating, because it has the potential, to shape culture, to influence what people are, people's beliefs, and like their ideology, as you say, even food to fashion to everything, everything. That's how powerful, our stories, the stories we tell about ourselves are, and we can see it. People are dying in some countries because of perpetuation of such stories.
Yeah.
Do you see? Okay, it's been a really beautiful show. Honestly, there's one big question that has been on my mind. I should have asked you in the beginning. In South Africa, it amazes me how the xenophobic attacks are geared towards African nationals. Why though? It's puzzling for me, and I really
It,
need answers.
it's puzzling for me as
It
well.
is.
It's I think
Why?
that I think that there is a the way I explain it to myself would be, if you attacked a Nigerian,
Hmm.
there will be no consequence. But you dare attack an American, the American government are going to find you, your family,
Ah.
your grandchildren, even your next generation. They'll, you know,
Oh.
but there are consequences. So I think it's a question of consequence. Everything is always a question of consequence.
Oh.
It doesn't seem to be a consequence
Hmm.
to perpetrating these attacks against us. But
Hmm.
there'll probably be some consequence if you try to attack a non-African who, yeah, that's what I think. That's how I'll say it.
Wow. And this brings me to the narrative thing, because I can imagine some country in, I don't mean to say this, but maybe Eastern Europe or something, some country in Asia that doesn't even have this sort of power of governance, like doesn't even have this sort of intentional government that would raise such an eyebrow to make sure that there's consequence against maybe one of their citizens that was attacked. Maybe some small country, because we have all these countries everywhere. But because we know that there are whites in America, there are whites in the UK, there are whites in France, there are in China. These are countries with so much power and voice, in the world. And so they just attribute it to, it's still the same narrative. They just, the
The
same
same.
respect will just go round. So everyone
Yes.
with that sort of, who's looking Asian or who's looking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I never really, I always thought about that. Honestly, I feel so sorry for the South Africans. I'm like, they must have gone through a lot with the appetite. I know that they
Mm,
went through a lot because when I read about appetite, it was a horrible, horrible, horrible system. Horrible. And I remember as a child, my siblings bear me witness that I used to say, "Oh, I'm South African." I used to relate to South Africa. And South Africa was my dream come true along with France. I
mm,
really wanted to go to South Africa. I thought
mm.
they were like the most wonderful and lovely people, and I kind of like look like them, and I was gonna fit in as a South African,
I
only to
imagine
grow
a
up.
lot of them are actually.
I
I
can
imagine.
imagine that a lot of them will still be, but look at
Yeah.
what we're seeing about them in the media, and I
Mm.
can imagine that we meet a South African on the road, it will be why do you hate us?
And they don't even. Maybe they don't even.
And maybe they can't even relate to that
You can't
problem.
relate to that.
They can't relate.
Um,
Oh my God, Nana, you are such a gem. It's been a phenomenal time having you on the show, guys. Guys, this has been a great show. If Africa is to grow not just economically but culturally, we must have, stronger, internal narratives, better representation, more storytelling, because it connects directly to everything that we have discussed today, from global media consolidation to African content ownership. Guys, narrative control is power. There's a reason why three states will come together to move to consolidate on such a legacy and such a global media outfit, to own it for many years to come. Okay. So thank you for joining in. Thank you for listening to us today. Thank you, Nana, for being on the show. And that's our show today, guys. Thank you for joining us on Inside VirtX Live, where we're not just bringing you reports, but we're making sense of it. And we're uncovering the systems that are influencing, shaping culture in the media world. I'm your host, Mary Jane, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.